Good morning. My name is Jeff Schock. I'm one of the pastors here at Crossroads, and I'm excited, very excited, to be able to share today's teaching with you. We've been going through the book of Exodus for some weeks now, and we're getting to one of the high points, not just in Exodus, but in all of biblical literature. This is a very, very famous and well-known part of the narrative, and so I want to invite you to turn to Exodus 14. I'm going to read the passage on which this teaching is based. It's going to be verses 11 through 31. I'd invite you to follow along. Exodus 14, verse 11. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water, so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them. And I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen." Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went near the other all night long. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it to dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued them, and all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. And this is the word of the Lord. There are kind of two views of what it means to be saved by God. And I'm painting in broad strokes here, but there is what I'll call a modern secular or liberal view. This is what you encounter at every funeral. It doesn't really matter who died, what their faith tradition was, or how big a scoundrel they were, they're always in a better place. And so in this kind of modern, secular, liberal view, salvation is something that's just, well, that's just everybody. And then you have, I'll contrast that with the, we'll call it the conservative, uber-religious view. And I heard this joke years ago, and I went to a Baptist seminary, so I feel like I'm on safe ground here. And it kind of goes like this. It said, in the ultra-religious view, it's, very, very few people are saved. And the joke goes like this. What did one Baptist say to the other Baptist? Well, there's probably only 2 people here who are saved, and I'm not sure about you, right? So it's this really narrow thing. But, and so this this language of sin and salvation, it's kind of dropped from our parlance, but there's probably no better place in the Bible that describes what it means to be saved by God than this story of God saving Israel out of Egypt, his miraculous divine intervention, parting the Red Sea, and bringing them literally from slavery to freedom, from oppression to, out of slavery to freedom, from death to life, literally. And so we want to look at it under three headings for you note takers, those of you who are in the growth groups right now. We're going to look at the rescue, redemption, and the Redeemer. Okay, the rescue, the redemption, the Redeemer. I got all R's. I feel pretty good about that. All right. First, the rescue. What are they being rescued from? If you've been here over these weeks, you know that Exodus is really, it's the continuation of Genesis. It went from this macro narrative of God and creation down to a people narrative, and we have the story of the Israelites who were sojourning in Egypt to escape a famine, a series of kings had come and gone, and the new reigning aristocracy, Pharaoh, the Israelites have fallen out of favor. The Israelites had multiplied. They were so numerous that they were viewed as a threat. So Egypt enslaved the Israelites, and they were enslaved for 400 years. And if you've been here for these weeks, you know that things have been getting worse and worse. We find out that the Egyptians are killing Israelites. They're subjecting them to incredible cruelty, kind of the horrific event that precipitated Israel's finally crying out to God and him sending a deliverer was Pharaoh ordering that all the male children of the Israelites needed to be killed, to be thrown into the Nile. And then God sends a deliverer. He sends Moses. And if you've been here, we looked at the plagues. God does this miraculous thing where he sends a series of plagues to demonstrate his power, not just to the Israelites, to the Egyptians, so that he can finally ultimately deliver them out of Egypt, just like he promised. And if you know that he turns the Nile, he turns the water to blood, and then there's a plague of frogs and a plague of gnats and a plague of flies, and then there's a plague of hail, and then there's a plague of darkness, and then finally there is the death of the firstborn. And that is the straw that breaks the camel's back, proverbially, right? So finally, Pharaoh and all of Egypt is like, just go. Take your stuff and go. Take our stuff and go. And so they let him go. They escape. They go. They leave Egypt. They come out from under the yoke of Pharaoh. They're freed from slavery, and they start traveling through the desert towards the Red Sea. What's really interesting is the Bible even makes note of this. As you read along with us, you'll see that they took a rather circuitous route. They went in a way that nobody would have anticipated them going. And so Pharaoh must have had some scouts. He was aware of their location, and it looked like a tactical blunder. They had gone all the way, a long way around the mountain, and they ended up right at the shores of the Red Sea, trapped between water and a vast desert. And what's really interesting is probably the funniest verse in all of Exodus is in 14:5, where it says, we didn't read it, but let me read it for you now. It says, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and lost their services. That's just kind of tongue-in-cheek when you hear it read like that. And so they have this moment, this epiphany. Yeah, despite the fact that God had shown up and he had displayed his power and his might through the series of plagues, despite the fact that, and the final one was the death of the firstborn, killed every firstborn in all of Egypt that wasn't covered under the blood of the Lamb. We learned about that last week. And so despite this incredible display of power, here we have Israel is walking it back, and they're saying like, wow, we let them go. We lost their services. And so Pharaoh, because of his hard heart, he sends the totality of his military power to pursue Israel. And so here's the important realization we need to make at this point in the narrative. Israel had been free. They were taken out of Egypt. Their shackles were gone. They were no longer slaves. They were out from under. They had their, Pharaoh's boot on their neck for all this time, and then all of a sudden they're free. But they're not really free. They're not physically free, right? Because they're still being pursued. They have the most ascendant military power of the time. These are refugees being pursued by horses and chariots. Horses and chariots would have been the equivalent of tanks and armor and helicopters, if we're putting it in a kind of a modern context. And so here you've got these Israelites, and they are literally stuck between a rock and a hard place. They're stuck against, with water on one side and Pharaoh pursuing them on the other. So in a sense, they are not physically free. They're under the threat of being re-enslaved or killed. That's what's on the table, right? So though they are out from under the yoke of the Egyptians, they are in a way, they're free but not free. However, the really important point, the glaring point here in the text is that they've been free in a sense, but they are still slaves psychologically and spiritually. And I'll read it for us in verses 11 and 12. This is right where we started. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'?" Now, if you've been here, if you've been attending these services, if we've been teaching through it, if you're reading it on your own, and I would encourage you to read it. This is a real page turner. They never said that. That's not what they said. I'll take you to Exodus 4:29. This is what it says. It says, Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders and the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshiped. Okay. So you have Israel enslaved for 400 years. Finally, the persecution is ramping up, and it's unconscionable, and they're crying out to God, and God hears their cry, and he sends a deliverer, and he sends these incredible signs, these plagues, and through his power and his might, he makes a way for Israel to leave. And then Israel says what to Moses? He's saying, "Didn't we tell you to leave us alone? You should have left us in Egypt. Weren't there enough graves?" So they're really whiny here, right? They never, and here's this, they never said, "Leave us alone." They were blown away. God sent those plagues to demonstrate his power, his sovereignty, his might, not just to Egypt, but to Israel. Can you imagine? Can you imagine waking up the day after the first Passover and the firstborn in every home is dead unless you took shelter under the blood of the Lamb? Can you imagine being there when the Nile River was turned to blood and all the ensuing plagues that came? And here they are, like moments later in the context of this narrative, and they're saying, "Didn't we tell you to leave us alone?" They didn't say that. What's happened? They are, in one sense, free, but in another sense, not free, right? They had been, literally, their shackles are gone. Literally, their chains are gone. They are out from under the yoke of Pharaoh. But they are still psychologically, spiritually, still in slavery. Now, this is kind of the big point of Exodus. It's this is where it is particularly relevant for us. You'll hear us talking, or me specifically, talking about how we live in a post-Enlightenment culture. In the 1800s, there were some philosophers like John Locke and some others that rebutted what was the kind of stereotypical approach in traditional societies for thousands of years, that individual people don't really have any intrinsic worth. They are subordinate to the good of the group, right? Your family is kind of more important than the individual. The group, the clan, the tribe is more important than the individual. And then all of a sudden you had some philosophers in the 1800s who said, you know what? Individual people have intrinsic worth and value. It's right so far as it goes. We live in the shadow of that. And so what you have to see is the way that this text absolutely calls that thinking on the carpet. We have this idea of freedom in the West, which is, it's essentially this, I can do whatever I want, whenever I want. That's our view of freedom, right? There are absolutely zero restrictions on individual choice, and if that is the case, then you are free. The writer of Exodus and God, through this story, is making the case that is simply not on the menu. They're in freedom in the sense that perhaps we understand it because of where we are in our cultural moment isn't actually on the menu. It's not a possibility. And I want you to see something really interesting. You can be free and not free at all. They're technically free because they've gotten out from under the yoke of Pharaoh, but they have yet to come under the yoke of God on Mount Sinai. We're going to get to that in a couple of weeks. So they've been freed from slavery. They're taken out of Egypt. Pharaoh is no longer has his boot on their neck, but they have yet to receive the law from God on Sinai. And so in a literal sense, they are free. But look how Israel contrasts Moses. What happens in verse 13, and by the way, Moses' response to Israel's fear and trepidation and lack of faith is what has endeared him to millions of people for thousands of years. This is what he says. He says, Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." What a leader. Oh my gosh, you've somehow managed to get everybody out of Egypt. You've got all the livestock, you've got all the gold, you're gone. And the people he's leading were so soon to forget the providence, the provision, and the power of God. And here's Moses. He's cool as a cucumber. He is exuding confidence and faith, and he's supposed to be a contrast. I mean, it's right after Israel saying, "We're not enough graves in Egypt, you had to take us out of here. We said, leave us alone." They never said that, but here's Moses, and he looks amazing. And it's an intentional contrast. We're supposed to see that. And the difference between Moses and Israel is Moses has seen God. Moses is now and has been for some time in a covenant relationship with God. And it is that covenant relationship, he is now under the yoke of God, has somehow undergirded him and galvanized him with this incredible faith and bravery. Israel is kind of between two ports. The best metaphor I could think of is when I was serving in the military, you would get orders to a different duty station, and you had like a couple of weeks to report. And in the middle, you weren't under this chain of command because you had left that duty station, and you had yet to check into this duty station, so you were not yet under that chain of command. You'd go kick it on the beach for a couple of weeks. It was fine. You never check in early. If you've been in the military, you know why. They do horrible things to you if you have spare time on your hands. They sent me one time to a non-lethal weapons training testing facility. Just fill in the gaps. That was a rough week. Never check in early. But they were very literally between two different chains of command. And so they were, in a sense, free, but not free. And, you'll see this. You'll see people that come from certain socioeconomic conditions. They might rise above those conditions. They might change their stars, but they still respond in a way that seems like they're slaves to circumstances which are no longer their own. I think of if you're old enough, you probably have some relatives, maybe some grandparents or some great-grandparents who lived through the Great Depression. I think of my grandparents, Mildred and E.J. Costello, and they lived through the Great Depression. And even though my great-grandfather had done very well for himself, he was a captain of industry, became a vice president of a company, they still lived with a kind of scarcity mindset until their old age. They were still sticking money in couch cushions. Right? They were free in a sense from those circumstances, but psychologically and spiritually, they were still in bondage. This is in contrast to Moses, who, because of the fact that he was, this idea of personal freedom where I just have no restrictions on my personal choice, it's a fallacy. It's a fallacy. Moses is such an exemplar because it's not because he's free in the sense that he has complete permissiveness in regard to his personal choice, because he is an exemplar because he's in covenant service to God. Do you see? This is why Israel's acting so cowardly and so faithless, and this is why Moses is such a shining star here in this text. And this is. And we've been making the point all along, the title of this series is The Gospel According to Moses, because every person who's ever been born is going through an exodus of their own. right? And the idea that somehow you're gonna experience this complete freedom that is the absence of restriction on personal choice is just silly. It's one of the overwhelming themes in Exodus. We've pointed this out all along. Moses never says, God never says, let my people go. He says, let my people go so that they can worship me. Right? Let my people go so that they can worship me. Freedom isn't a complete restriction from impingement on personal choice. It is freedom to serve God. And here's the deal. Everybody, like Bob Dylan said, everybody serves something. Becky Pippert is a Christian novelist and poet, and she said it beautifully. She wrote this. She said, whatever controls us is our Lord. The person who seeks power is controlled by power. The person who seeks acceptance is controlled by the people he or she wants to please. We do not control ourselves. We are controlled by the Lord of our lives. Everybody serves something. And this is the big theme in Exodus. In 1 John, we find out, this is what 1 John 2:15 says, do not love the world or anything in the world. If anyone loves the world, love for the Father is not in them. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, comes not from the Father, but from the world. The world and its desires pass away, but whoever does the will of God lives forever. Unless you are in covenant service to God, unless you are enslaved to God, unless God is your master, you are serving something else. And it might be something nefarious. Whenever you think about idolatry or something like that, it always conjures really sinful behavior. Thinking maybe it's drugs or alcohol. But I have to tell you that is the idol of personal comfort, right? Or maybe it's something good. Maybe it's something noble. I have a good marriage. I love my wife. We've been together 20-something years. The challenge with a good marriage is you could tend to make that relationship and that other person an idol, a main operative influence. Their happiness, their health, their well-being, the most important thing in your life. And the Bible says that whatever you put on the throne of your life is, in a sense, your master. So sometimes these things aren't bad things like drugs and alcohol or greed or sex. They're good things like kids and family and spouses. But here's the deal. If you put that kind of pressure on a child, they will probably, in all likelihood, they will buckle under the pressure of being the main operating influence in your life. Like their happiness is so important to you, it will crush them. And if you make a spouse into the ultimate thing in your life, it will crush them. And that outlook and that framework will probably have the opposite of the effect as what you desire. And because here's the simple reality is no human being was meant to bear that kind of weight, right? And so the idea of this, like, well, we're completely free, you're going to serve something. The philosophers talked about how humans are telic creatures. That means we need to have purpose. We need to have some kind of meaning in our life. Years ago, when I was first a Christian, Rick Warren wrote a famous book called The Purpose-Driven Life. And this was the general thesis is that you've been created to serve God. He's the author of creation. He's made you. He knit you together. And as the author, as the inventor, he has every right to describe what you were created to do. And you were created to serve him. And so this idea that you're free from being enslaved to anything is a notion that's foreign to the Bible. You're going to serve something, and the entire message of Exodus is serve me. This is what God's saying. And whatever it is you find that you're putting your hope in, that you're looking to for your ultimate significance, your salvation, anything that you said, I have to have that, or I can't be happy, I can't be complete, and that is not God, you are a slave to that thing. So the rescue, what are you freed from? Every human being that's ever been born is experiencing in Exodus, and God's salvific work on the cross was meant to set you free from false masters that will not serve you, that will demand sacrifice after sacrifice from you. They'll never give their life for you. They'll demand that you give your life to them. So you're rescued from what? Slavery. Next, redemption. How does it happen? There's a famous Scottish Presbyterian minister named Thomas Chalmers, who preached a very, very famous sermon, and you can go Google it. And the sermon is called the Expulsive Power of New Affections. And the quote, the salient quote from the sermon is this: "The only way to dispossess the heart of an old affection is by the expulsive power of a new one." Here's the meaning. You cannot simply white knuckle it. You can't come to Christ. You can't go before God and say, I'm going to put you on the pedestal of my life, and I'm just going to try really hard, and I'll try to screw myself up in order that I will just like love you and love you alone and have no other gods before you. You have to experience something. You have to experience the expulsive power of a new affection, according to Chalmers. This is exactly what happened for Israel. They're between a rock and a hard place. They are trapped between a vast desert and the most ascendant military power anybody had ever seen. Their fate is certain and sealed. It is enslavement or violent death. And then God shows up. And then what happens? And I have to mention it here. There's something in your Bible. There's probably a little footnote where it says, textual variant, that this could be the Red Sea or the Sea of Reeds. And some liberal theologians have taken that to demythologize this account and say, well, it was really just a marsh and it was low tide. And there's nothing in the original language or in the text that seems to indicate that this was anything short of the most profound miracle anyone had ever seen. One of the key principles of biblical interpretation is that a text can never mean what it never meant. Both the narrator and the original hearers of this text, and in the original Hebrew language, the allusion and the underpinnings of extreme supernatural power of God, providential work of God is hanging all over the place. God did something amazing. And then Israel's heart, what happened? Israel, they end up renewing their faith in God's plan, renewing their faith in Moses, and they end up following him. Once God parted the waters, they walked through. And then Israel was decimated. Have you ever seen Prince of Egypt, the Disney movie? I love that scene when the waters part and there's like whales. You've seen it, right? They leave out all the dead bodies washing up all over the shore. Egypt was decimated, was destroyed. One moment, Israel is under the threat of slavery and death. They're facing an enemy they could never fight. And then all of a sudden, God shows up and he does something extraordinary. He parts these waters, and all they have to do is cross over to the other side. And they go from death to life just by crossing over. Very interesting in 1 John 5. John 5, 24. Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, whoever hears my words and believes him who sent me has eternal life and will not be judged, but has crossed over from death to life." This is a very interesting choice of words. And the commentators, they pick up on it. Jesus uses those words. This is an allusion to what God did at the Red Sea. The only thing that is necessary for a Christian to be saved is to cross over from death to life. We do I study with a lot of people who are thinking and considering baptism. And we go through great pains during the course of that study to make sure that whoever is considering baptism understands that you are saved by grace through faith in Jesus plus nothing. Right? It has been said that the only thing you need to be saved by Christ is nothing, and very few people have it. The only thing Israel needed to be saved, they needed the power of God. All they needed to do was cross over. This is the picture Jesus gives us of what it means to be saved, to cross over from death to life. You are saved by faith, by grace, through faith in Jesus, plus nothing. And this, by the way, is the Christian doctrine of justification. And it's a legal term. There's two terms we talk about in the baptism study. If you're considering it, write it down on the card. We'll definitely connect with you. There's sanctification. Sanctification is the lifelong process where God, through his Spirit and through providence and through his people, conforms you to the image of Jesus. It's the lifelong process where God makes you holy, and it does not stop this side of heaven. The day that God punches your tickets, the day you punch out of here, you're still gonna have some issues. That's the bad news. Here's the good news. There is another doctrine, and it is the one Jesus is talking about, that you cross over. The minute you believe, you cross over from death to life. This is called justification, and it's a legal term. If you were on trial for something, let's say you were a capital offense, maybe you got crazy, or you didn't get crazy, you're found innocent, for the metaphor to work. You have to be found innocent. And the judge bangs his gavel, and he says, not guilty, you're free to go. You have been justified. That is what happens the moment you put your faith in Jesus. In Ephesians 2, Paul gives us a kind of functioning definition for what grace is. He says, it is for by grace you have been saved. And this is the gift of God, he says. And the word grace means gift. It's like a kind of double entendre. He's saying it twice. It is a gift. All you need to do is receive it. All you need to do is cross over. There was nothing so meritorious about you that you're going to take a resume of good deeds, that you're going to take your Christian service, your Christian witness, whatever it is, and hand it to God and say, now you owe me something. It's just not how it works. You need redemption, right? And so it's by faith that you enter into a saving relationship with Jesus. And what's really, if you want to understand to a greater extent what that means, read John's gospel. He talks about how when you enter into that relationship with Jesus by grace through faith, that you become a child of God. Child of God. I'm always using this example because it's the most palpable for me, but I still have the picture of me holding Jake in my hands the day he was born. Have you seen him? He's like 300 pounds. But I remember when he was 8 point something, and he looked like a shriveled old Italian man. I thought he looked just like my grandfather. And I thought, if you've ever held your baby, you never loved anything this much. I promise you. Any parents in the room, you can just ask them. You never loved anything like this. The scriptures say that when you put your faith in Jesus, you cross over, and now you become a child of God. And God's love is on your life. And look, as much as I love my sons, and that's a lot, the love that God has for you because of Jesus, because he took away your sins, because he allowed you to cross over from death to life. Now you become a child of God, and his love is perfect. His love it's not flawed like mine. It's perfect. He loves you perfectly. No father ever loved a son like this, and because of Jesus, now that love lands on you. You're redeemed. And so you go, it's a change in status. You go from being under the penalty of death, you go from being a slave, you go from death to life, and it's just by crossing over. Now, finally, we have to get to the Redeemer. We're talking about, what are you escaping from? You're escaping from slavery. And then how do you escape from? You escape by redemption. You've seen something so beautiful in Jesus that it has this expulsive power. You've experienced his love and his mercy, and you've seen his grace and his power in such a way that it's blown your socks off. And now there are other things that are going to compete for the throne of in your heart, but you have seen something so profound that it's an expulsive power of new affection. Finally, we have to get to the Redeemer, and there's a really interesting thing that happens here in the text, and I want you to see it. This is, we're talking about verses 11 through 15, and I don't want anyone to miss this. In verses 11, there's Egypt saying, weren't there any graves in Egypt? You had to take us out into the desert. And in verse 12, they say, didn't we tell you, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? And then Moses answered, and he looks great. Don't be afraid. Stand firm. Israel, they look like idiots. Moses looks awesome. But then in verse 15, then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Wait a minute. Well, that's weird, isn't it? All of a sudden, Israel is behaving badly. Israel is acting in a way that does not exemplify the faith that you think they would have at this point after seeing God's hand and his power and the plagues and the deliverance. And Moses he looks like an example. He's a pillar of bravery and strength and faith. And then God says to Moses, why are you crying out to me? It seems like Moses is getting the rebuke that Israel deserves. Then, if you go further on in the story of the Exodus, there is one of the most profound national tragedies in Israel's history happens just a short while after this. They finally make it to Sinai. Moses goes up. He's getting the law from God. They're founding doctrinal, moral principles that would guide God's people for thousands of years. And then it didn't take Israel very long. By the time he comes down the mountain, they have made an idol. They've made a calf to bow down and worship. And if you read it closely, it sure looks like it was kind of like Burning Man. It was kind of a rowdy, there was revels, okay? And Moses comes down the mountain and he's aghast. And then what does he say? What does he say? He says in Exodus 32:30, the next day Moses said to the people, you have committed a great sin, but now I will go up to the Lord. Perhaps I can atone for your sin. Here you have Israel behaving badly, Israel looking faithless, Israel looking recalcitrant. And then Moses is looking awesome, but he gets the rebuke that Israel deserves. And then again, Israel sins, but then Moses says, perhaps I can go atone for their sin. What is he doing? He's acting like a mediator. He's acting like a go-between. He's acting like, it seems like everything that happens to Israel, all the negative penalty that they deserve is landing on him. And then he is going up to make the case to atone to God for Israel. It's all on his shoulders. We have called this series The Gospel According to Moses because Moses points to another mediator, somebody who functioned in very much the same way. And what's really interesting, Brandon made this point last week. There was the very first Passover where God instructs Israel, you're going to sacrifice these little lambs, and you're going to paint their blood over your doorpost, and that will be a sign that the destroyer angel, think about that for a minute, how absolutely horrifying that prospect is going to pass over you. God's wrath will pass over you for this night. But what's really interesting in that passage is he tells them, don't go out, whatever you do, don't go outside. There was something that wasn't super effective about the sacrifice and the blood of those lambs. The efficacy of that sacrifice, you had to be under that doorpost. The destroyer was coming for everybody. But it was because of the blood of that little lamb that if they were under that blood, God's wrath passed over them. Years and years later, Jesus would celebrate the Last Supper, the last Passover with his disciples. And he would take the cup and he would take the bread and he imbued them with different meaning. And he said, this is about me. It has been pointed out by commentators over and over, and I think it's one of the most interesting observations about the texts that describe the Last Supper where Jesus is with his disciples in the upper room. They describe somebody dipping their hand in the bowl with him, but it is noted that there was no lamb on the table because the lamb was at the table. Jesus was that Passover lamb. And if you put his blood over the doorpost of your life, God's wrath passes over forever and ever. And just like Moses was that mediator, God's wrath at Israel's faithless, recalcitrant heart lands on Moses. The sin of anybody who would ever call on his name lands on Jesus. Now, I've tried to do the math on my own a couple of times, but I put it in ChatGPT this week. You want to guess how many Christians have ever lived, how many people have ever bowed their knee and put their faith in Jesus Christ? ChatGPT puts it at somewhere between 10 and 20 billion. And there's a lot. On the cross, Jesus paid for the sins of anybody who ever called on his name. He endured the punishment that was meant for billions and billions of people. Quite literally, he suffered a billion hells. He was the Redeemer. He's the new and better Moses. He got the rebuke. He got the punishment. He got the wrath that we deserved. So we could get the love and the glory that he deserves. That's why in John, Jesus says you'll be called children of God. you know how much God loves his children? And you will not experience the expulsive power of a new affection until you understand how much it cost. All of the things that Jesus endures on the cross, they point right back to the Exodus. These are the plagues. This is the undoing of creation. What is it? There is blood. There is water. There is darkness. Darkness is always emblematic of God's judgment. And then there is a flood. And the flood is the wrath of God that is poured out on Jesus. This is why it says, the very last thing Jesus does is he screams out. He screams out. And you don't know what he screams until you get to John's gospel, where he says, "It is finished." And it's very interesting. We have little bills of sale from the 1st and 2nd century that have that word in Greek. It's telestai. And they would write that on a bill when it said when they had paid it in full. Jesus has experienced the judgment of God. He is the only person in all of history that is in a position to recognize the profound suffering and misery and wrath of God's judgment. And he cries out, "It is finished." He's paid the price. On the cross, he was ripped across heaven. He lost the love of the Father so that you could have it. You have to count the cost, because only then can you experience something that so fills your heart that the only way you can rid yourself of all the things that would vie for primacy in your life is seeing Jesus is absolutely beautiful. And when you see how much he gave to see you go free, then your heart melts. Then you can say, "I will serve you and you alone. I'll make you the Lord of my life." But you've got to fall in love. This is the word of the Lord.